Alright guys, welcome back to another video. So in this one we're building a fairly simple tall cabinet. Now the design process for this one was interesting because I had two basic ideas that I was working off from. I'd seen a lot of these tall cabinets that they're either the shaker style or they're a very common thing. They'd go in the corner of a room and they were just meant to be a tall but narrow cabinet to kind of fill in some empty spaces. The other design idea I wanted to try was seeing just how dark I could go with a piece of furniture. Now, dark furniture is kind of iconic of the Gothic style of furniture, but in my case, that style does not really go with the type of furniture that I like to build. So the inspiration for this project very quickly became maybe a shaker who listened to a little bit too much My Chemical Romance growing up and has hit their emo phase right here. So we're taking that nice simple shaker style, but then we're going with as dark of pieces as possible. The only problem we can potentially run into with this idea of just making this piece as dark as possible is that you can very quickly lose the visual interest of the piece. Because what makes natural wood so special is that it has all these little color variations in it that bring in depth and just interesting looking pieces. So when you cover those pieces with stain or even paint, you lose all of that natural coloring that brings in that definition. So it's very important to be careful what wood you choose. And in this case I'm using white ash because it's got a very open porous structure, which means that once we do all of our staining, those grains are still going to easily show through all of that stain. So moving back to the design here, we're building this cabinet with a post leg construction. So that means we have four fairly tall posts that are then going to hold and support everything else. Now, I've talked about this lots in the past. This is absolutely my favorite way to build furniture because it's so just stable and strong, and it's honestly super easy to do. As long as you take the time to get your legs nicely squared up, this is by far the easiest method of building I've ever found. Now the only downside to it is that it can be a bit more expensive. Because you need to work with 8-quarter stock in order to make those legs most of the time, it's gonna be a bit more pricey, but again, it makes life so much easier. Now one of the things that I actually found very interesting while working on this project, at least in these early phases, was just how much I've learned over the past few years I've been woodworking. Because in the early stages of this project, everything was just going so smoothly. I'm not going to say that I didn't make any minor mistakes or anything, but I just kind of knew what I needed to do and I just followed the steps. And everything did come together really, really nicely. And it was those kinds of realizations that just kind of made me super happy with where I am as a woodworker. It's one of those things that I always have to kind of remind myself that I'm a fully self-taught woodworker. Everything I've learned about woodworking, I've basically learned from YouTube. Now that's not a brag, it's actually led to quite a few problems in the past, but the fact that I've gotten to where I am just based off of all the free knowledge and that I've picked up from around the internet is absolutely amazing, and that's one of the main reasons why I make these videos, is because I've spent so much time learning everything I possibly can from people for free on the internet that I want to help share as much knowledge as I possibly can too. So in the spirit of giving back to the community and helping new woodworkers like myself, I've now listed all of my plans for most of my recent projects completely for free on my website. Now there is paid versions that do have a little bit more information and whatnot, but the free versions are easily enough to start making any projects you've seen on my channel. And the whole purpose again behind that is that I just want to help people learn the same way that I learned, because that's one of the problems that I ran into all the time when I was just trying to figure stuff out is, figuring out scale and the size of a structure and all that kind of stuff was very challenging, and plans are super expensive most of the time. So if you guys are interested, there'll be a link in the description of this video, or you can just head over to my website to find all those plans. But yeah, I highly recommend you go and check them out, even if you're not looking to build this project for yourself. But with the structure now together, you can see that I'm also trying another kind of new design style, and that is big open spaces. So if you look back at most of my past projects, I always tend to break up my side panels and have all these different shapes and whatnot in there. Or I put in multiple levels of drawers, doors, whatever. What I want to do on this project is work with some large pieces. Because for the longest time now, I've had this massive 16-inch wide piece of white oak sitting in my shop, and I just haven't known what to do with it. It's just been sitting there because it's too wide to be broken down into smaller pieces. It just feels like such a shame. But I also couldn't figure out a way to use it in its full form. So what I wanted to do with this project is just bite into that piece. So my original plan was to use most of that piece of wood, but I actually ended up changing that up, and you guys will see that as we go through the project here. But I ended up using just a small portion of that piece, and now with that leftover section, I actually have a whole bunch more ideas. But again, the big thing with this project is I just wanted to work with large panels. And of course, because I love having a challenge, I decided to go through and make it so that I had to have each one of these large panels curved on the top edges. I don't know why I thought this was a good idea, but the design just looked so good in the 3D model that I just had to go for it. And then using my compass plane here to just get these as perfect as possible between each of the curves, because the more similar they are, the easier my job is going to be later on to actually fit up the panels, because at this point in time I had absolutely no idea how I was going to make these panels follow that curve, because the other challenge that I decided to throw in there is that I wanted each of these panels to have a raised profile as well, which means that the top edge of that panel has to follow the exact curve that I'm cutting into this piece in order for that raised profile to match. So you can see here, this is the piece that I actually ended up going out and buying. This is a piece of 14-inch wide white ash, and we're going to be using this for the side panels and the door panel. Now I specifically went out and bought this piece. Even though I have that wider piece of white oak, I wanted to get white ash because it is more grainy and more porous, so that on our side panels and the door panel, they will have a much more obvious grain structure, visible grain structure to them. And that was super important to me. This also worked out a lot better. I got a lot better use of materials. I didn't have very much waste and all that, so it was just a much more efficient way of using a piece of wood. And I have to say that this is the coolest thing I have done in a long time. It's been forever since I've worked with wide pieces. I don't know if I've ever actually worked with this wide of a piece that hasn't been paneled or glued up at any point. And it's just such a cool thing. Like, seeing a piece of wood that is this wide. I know for my American viewers, people who live where these kinds of trees grow, this is probably not the most exciting thing. But for me, I've never seen a very large hardwood tree. Living on the prairies, our trees out here don't get very big, so just even the idea that you could get this 14-inch wide board from a tree, to me, is just such a cool thing. And so I wanted to do them justice. So with some sheer panic at first, I quickly figured out the best way to fit up these panels, and that was just to make a nice simple template. So all I'm doing here is using some 1/4-inch hardboard, and I use my compass plane to perfectly match the curvature of this top to the curvature in our top stretcher pieces. I can then clear up the waste in the bandsaw and then use a flush trim bit in my router to match that curve from the template to these larger ash pieces. This let me guarantee that these panels, once we had the raised profile and all that on them, that they would perfectly fit into the grooves that I already had, or into that top curved shape. Now, it was still very stressful, but it definitely was much easier than trying to actually shape these panels after the fact. So I'm very glad I thought of this. This was a very last minute process, but this is definitely something that I'm going to be using a lot more in the future, because not only does it look a little bit more interesting, but it also just shows another level of skill. Because a square panel is super easy to fit up, but as soon as you put any kind of curvature to it, all of a sudden you now have a whole lot more work to do, and it just adds that little bit of an extra special touch. Even if your average person isn't going to, understand or appreciate it, at least to other woodworkers, they know that just by adding that simple curve there, you've now basically doubled the amount of work you're gonna have to do. From there though, is just an easy fit up. All I do is just use my raveted block plane here and just adjust those tongues from the backside. Again, that's important to mention. You always want to do your adjustments on the backside because you are going to get a little bit of tear out, but I can just adjust it until it perfectly fit into those grooves. And you can see here how that panel all starts coming together. And this was my first kind of wow moment in this project, because I'd seen it in the 3D models. I had an idea of what it was I was making, but starting to see these large panels come together and the whole structure, just kind of seeing it come together, just felt so good. I can't describe it, but it felt so good seeing these large pieces of wood being a part of this piece of furniture that I was starting to create. Moving on to the door now, this is basically the exact same as the side panels we just made, just on a smaller scale. The only challenge with the door though is that it has to come out pretty much perfectly square. Because we can't make any adjustments to these doors after they're glued up because they'll be stained and all that, we have to make sure that the door comes out almost perfect. And this is a very stressful thing to do, but the important thing there is that this is a healthy form of stress. I know that in the end, if this door doesn't come out perfectly, I always have the option to remake it. It's going to be annoying, but I have the option there that I can always just remake this door. So it's those healthy forms of stress that actually make these projects really fun, in my opinion. Challenging yourself and kind of pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone is a really good way to improve as a woodworker. And that's one of those things. You'll see it in my videos, but I also highly recommend you do it in your own projects, even if you don't share them on social media, anything like that, is that in every single project you do, push yourself to do at least a few new things. I've already talked about it a few times in this video. I'm trying a whole bunch of new stuff on this project alone just to see if I can put it together. Because the single best way to learn any technique in woodworking is to learn it while doing it in a practical way. So you want to learn how to add curves to a piece? Great. On your next project, plan to add curves to something. Don't do test pieces, don't do practice stuff, anything like that. I mean, practice a little bit before you go to a project, but try using these techniques on a project. Again, a perfect example on this project is I've never done a large panel with a curved top edge or any curves on them whatsoever. But by taking the risk on this project and pushing myself out of my comfort zone, I was able to create something that was just far more interesting than anything I think I've created in the past. Now, if you're going to push yourself to learn these new things, you also need to be open and accepting of failure, because failures are going to happen. I talk about it all the time in my videos. There's lots of times where I failed and I haven't shown it in videos because it's just too embarrassing. There's lots of failures that occur in the process of learning, and it's only after a ton of failures that you're actually going to learn. But the most important lesson I've learned in my life is that you do learn a lot more from failures than you will ever learn from successes. Let's say you built 10 cabinets and they all came out absolutely perfectly on the first try, but then on your 11th cabinet, everything goes wrong and you will have no idea why or how to fix those mistakes that come up throughout that whole process. But if you fail your way through the first 10 cabinets you ever build, from then on out, you'll start to learn those lessons very quickly and they'll become much more ingrained in your head. So my best advice is just open yourself up to failure. Push yourself outside of your comfort zone and be accepting and willing to fail at whatever it is you're doing. It might suck, it might be very disappointing, but you will learn something along the way. I can pretty much guarantee that. With the motivational speech out of the way, we're back onto the project here, and you can see just how well this door is starting to come together. And this was super exciting because just seeing how all the joinery lines up, how the panel fit in there nicely, everything about this door just was getting me so super excited. And just by dropping it in place and holding it in with a clamp, I was able to step back and just admire the point that I was already at in this project. With all of our joinery done, we can now move on to adding our reinforcements. So because I'm using traditional mortise and tenon joinery across all these pieces, I'm actually going to go through and add pins to them. Now, depending on how much time you spent on YouTube, you've probably heard about drawboard mortise and tenon joinery. That gets talked about a lot more often, but in my opinion, pinned mortise and tenon joinery is far more important. Now, the key difference there is that in drawboard mortise and tenon joinery, you're using the tension provided by that dowel to help hold everything together. Whereas with pinned mortise and tenon joinery, your holes are not offset whatsoever. Your holes are perfectly in line with each other, and this lets you easily insert and remove those dowels at any point in time, so when you're doing your dry assemblies, you can actually put everything together, lock it in with those pins, and not have to worry about anything moving around or coming apart. But then as soon as you want to disassemble it, you pull those pins out and you're good to go. Then when you do your final glue up, you actually just have to use glue. That's the main difference between a pinned mortise and tenon and a drawboard mortise and tenon. A drawboard mortise and tenon doesn't require any glue, whereas a pinned mortise and tenon still requires glue to help lock that pin in place. Both are equally strong, it's just the big difference there is that the pinned mortise and tenon does require that glue. But again, most of us are still going to use glue, even if we're doing drawboard mortise and tenons anyway. It just makes sense to make your life a little bit easier throughout the rest of the project and just use pinned mortise and tenon. Now, because I get questions about this all the time, we need to talk about the hinge spacer. Now, the hinge spacer is that thin piece of wood that you can see that I'm lining up right now. Now, the whole purpose of this piece is to make installing your hinges easier, because as you can see here, it's a heck of a lot easier to align my hinge mortises specifically to this piece, and this piece is sized specifically to the opening that my door is going to fit in. So rather than trying to align my door to the post legs that are in this structure, this is just a way easier way of alignment. Then the other part of this is that it also allows you to offset your hinges. So in this case, I'm having my door set back about 1/8 of an inch from the front of that post leg. If I didn't use the hinge spacer, the barrel part of the hinge would be pushed right up against the leg and the door probably wouldn't function properly. So as a rule of thumb, on smaller doors, I do 3/16 of an inch, and on doors like this, I do 1/4 inch just because that seems to scale a little bit better. So with everything together now, we can start working on kind of the pre-finishing work. So the first step here is to add in the shelf pin holes. Now all of our internal components are going to be based off of brass shelf pins, so it's very important that we put in these holes in a nice accurate way. And this is the best way I was able to figure out. Now this is just the Craig shelf pin jig. I don't recommend this product because it's not great, but I was able to kind of jerry rig it to help lock it into these pieces that I have and get myself pretty good results. So they weren't great, but they worked for what I needed. And so I'm putting these shelf pin holes basically all the way up the length of these, and then from there it's on to the whole finishing phase. To help justify my obsession with these older tools, I've been trying to use my hand planes far more often, and one of the things that I've found super interesting is the difference between a sharp and dull blade. Now this sounds pretty straightforward, but I guarantee you if you check out any woodworking forums or even the comment section of any video talking about hand planes, there will be tons of questions just asking how do you know when your blade is sharp or when it's dull or when it needs to be sharpened, all those kind of things. And I've never had a good answer for it, and I still don't think I have a great answer for it, but the best way that I started to kind of think about it in this project is as soon as I started to feel any resistance, as soon as the blade didn't very easily bite into the wood, I knew it was time to go back and just quickly hit it on some of my higher grit stones. So I didn't always go back and do a full sharpening, going from 1000 grit all the way up to 8000 grit. Sometimes if it was just feeling like I needed a little bit of extra edge on there, I would just go and hit it on the 8000 grit stone and just get that edge just slightly back, or even just on the strop too. So just getting in that habit of constantly keeping that blade nice and sharp actually made my finishing work a heck of a lot easier. And it's gotten me to the point now where I pretty much only use my hand plane for my finishing work, and I absolutely love that I can do that. I still do some hand sanding because with the stain and all that, you need to sand. I've talked about that in the video already, but it's just a way easier time using the hand plane for pretty much everything. So it's also very important to mention the order of operations here. So you can see that by going through and hand planing those legs first, it means that my legs are at their final thickness, because when you're hand planing, you are actually taking off thickness. And so it's very important to do that before you go through and pin your mortise and tenon, because if you go through and pin your mortise and tenon first, and then you go through and do your finishing work, your holes are going to be slightly offset from where they need to be in that finished form. Now you're probably expecting to see the staining process starting here, but we're not getting there just yet. We're not actually going to get there for a little while, because now what we need to go through and do is build out all of the internal components. So another really interesting design idea I had for this project was taking that dark exterior and then combining that with a light colored natural interior. So for the interior, I decided to go with white oak because it just has such a beautiful color, and the grain structure of that white oak is going to go super nicely with that ash that we're using everywhere else. And again, we're going to be keeping it natural because I really have been loving this combination of taking stained wood and kind of controlling and manipulating that color to be more of what I want, but also combining that with some natural wood. So again, on this project, because I knew I was going to have that super dark exterior that was all going to be stained, I thought it would be super cool that when you open the door of the cabinet or pull out one of the drawers, you'd end up seeing this just beautiful natural wood interior. I just thought that the idea of that combination was just so cool in my mind, and I have to say it came out really cool in the final piece here. But all we're doing here is building out basically 3 different sections. So we're going to have a bottom panel and a floating shelf that are basically the exact same. They're a flat book match panel that's reinforced with a sliding dovetail just to prevent that panel from warping. Then we also have a middle section that's going to contain 2 drawers that fit inside of the cabinet. Now again, another new technique that I've never tried before, putting drawers inside of a cabinet behind a door. Lots of math involved, but actually not as complicated as it might sound. And again, super fun and interesting thing to do. So for that drawer section, all I did was take the same 2 book matched panels, but we're just going to go through and put in some dividers between them. Now these dividers are pretty simple. All they are is a piece of poplar with a piece of white oak doweled and glued to the front edge. Now, if you're worried about wood movement, at this scale, it's completely negligible. We don't have to worry about wood movement ripping things apart because there's just not going to be enough potential energy stored in these pieces to cause them to break in the future. I would say as a rule of thumb, if you're doing anything over 5 inches, you'd want to make these dividers differently. You'd want to make them all with vertically oriented grains so that they can expand and contract the way that they would naturally want to. But in this case, because they're only 3.5 inches tall, we really don't have to worry about that kind of wood movement. Where we do have to worry about wood movement is in how we attach these pieces to those larger panels, because if we attach them wrong, they will genuinely rip those panels apart in the future. So with both the shelf and the bottom panel, all we're doing is adding in 3 screws. Now the middle screw is going to be perfectly fitted in place, and then the outer screws are going to be in a slot, so those will allow for whatever wood movement we need. Now, if you have a good setup for cutting sliding dovetails, you probably only need that middle screw, but because my router table is not great, I needed some extra pressure on the front and the back end, so those extra 2 screws just help pull everything a little bit tighter together. Then with the divider panels for the drawer section, we're just going to go through and get everything fitted up properly before we actually start to think of anything else. So you can see here how everything just slides together, and the real trick with this section is that we end up having to drop the cabinet on top of it. That's the only way to put this piece in. So it's really important, again, going back to our order of operations, one of the things that I stopped myself from doing was going through and finishing this whole cabinet and then worrying about making these pieces, because it would have been a real shame to scratch that staining job after everything was pretty much done. But then to make sure that these panels are locked in place, we're going to do kind of the opposite of what we did with the shelves. We're going to glue that front edge in so it's locked in place, and that screw that I put in the backside there is in a slot to allow for any potential wood movement of the panel itself. Now it kind of sucks that those screws are visible, but that is the best way I could think of to attach these components together. Then to fill up our little empty gap here, I just took a small piece, used my shooting board to fit everything up, and then some 15-minute epoxy to hold it in place, and this just gives us a nice easy fill for that spot. Onto our drawers now. We're going to be kind of bouncing back and forth between the drawers that are for the kind of the main cabinet that are that top section, as well as the ones for that internal smaller section. Now the reason I can do that is because all 4 drawer boxes are based off of the same sizing. So at least in this initial phase, we're making all of our pieces to 2 7/8. Because this perfectly fits an odd number of 5/16 inch pins. Now it's all very complicated, there's not a lot of math involved, but I promise it's a much simpler thing than it seems. Basically, anytime you're dealing with box joints, you always want to size the joint or size whatever it is you're making off of the specific joint. So thanks to the little book that comes with the lead jig, I knew that at 2 7/8 I'd fit X number of pins. So I just kind of made all of my drawers to fit that size. Now the problem that I did run into though is that my drawers for that middle cabinet section, they were meant to be 3 inches tall. Now in hindsight, going back into the design, if I'd been thinking properly, I would have just made them 2 7/8 and made my life a lot easier. But I didn't do that, and I'd planned everything else out around them being 3 inches tall. I'd already made all my dividers for them to be 3 inches tall, so I just kind of went for it. And so what I figured I could do is actually add in just a little bit more of an interesting detail. So I started by just making the normal drawers. So all 4 drawers at this point are all glued up, and they're all 2 7/8 inches tall. Once the glue had dried, I could go over the tops of these with my hand plane and get them perfectly flattened off and get them all nice and even. Because the really important thing here is with these smaller drawers, we're going to be adding on some trim to get them to that final 3-inch height that we now need. And we're going to be adding in a little bit of a contrast here by using some walnut pieces, and these are just going to be glued directly onto the pieces here. Now this is a really cool technique and definitely something that I've fallen in love with doing on a whole bunch of recent projects, because it's just the perfect way to highlight each one of these drawers. Because realistically with these walnut pieces, they're in their final size, they're only going to be not even a 1/16 of an inch thick. They're going to be a very minor layer, and by the time we put in our bevels and all that to help break the edges of the drawer, that walnut trim is basically invisible except for when you pull out the drawer. So it's just a super cool minor detail that really no one will ever notice. Probably most people wouldn't even appreciate the difference there, but it's just one of those cool little things that I got to add on. Now it was a bit of extra work, but it was also one of those small details that I absolutely love about these drawers. Just something that kind of stands out to me as the creator that I'll always know is just a little bit special. And I also know the reason that it's there is just purely because I kind of screwed up on my sizing when I was making the plans. But this is also one of those things that I really love about woodworking, because any mistakes that you make are always just an opportunity to make a more interesting or creative design. Again, I could have stressed out here and made my drawers 3 inches and then had to deal with the weird box joint sizing and whatnot, but just by taking the time to add on those little trim pieces, just created something that was genuinely more interesting and a little bit more special. Moving back to the larger 2 drawers, I decided to try something else new, and that is using just normal wooden drawer slides. Now this is nothing groundbreaking or like amazing to the woodworking community. This is just a technique that has been used for hundreds of years because it works super well, but I've just never thought to use it before for some bizarre reason. And what I can say about this is that I am genuinely surprised how much better this works compared to just having your drawer sit on a normal frame. Because there's 2 main benefits to this. For one, you can have free-floating drawer fronts, which means that you can end up having no space between the 2 of them, and it looks super cool. But it also is just super functional. It makes the drawer slide a lot easier because there's very little resistance, especially when you go through and wax up those slide areas. Now, because I knew I was going to be using those drawer slides, I decided to go in and add a little bit of an extra creative challenge, and that is adding a curve to both drawer fronts. Now this was an absolutely ridiculously challenging thing to do. I ended up screwing up a little bit and I had to glue some filler pieces onto both of the drawer fronts, but eventually I did actually get something that worked out really well. Now I say that this is challenging because not only do you have to make sure that both of those curves match, but you also have to make sure that your drawer fronts are sitting square in this opening that we've now created that doesn't really have any good square reference points. So overall, super challenging thing to do, but in the final piece, I think that these look absolutely amazing. And again, it's a very subtle touch, but it's just super impressive once you pick up on it. Then the final component is the tabletop. Now, as far as the parts of this project, this is the simplest piece of the whole thing, because it's just a nice square frame with a square floating panel, and everything came together really easily, because at this point in time, I had a good idea of what it was I was needed to do in order to make these pieces. Now, even doing stuff like this, though, I still genuinely appreciate the amount of skill that it takes even to get to this point. Like, for the longest time, I've had issues using my mortiser and getting nice square mortises, getting my tenons nicely sized up, and this is one of those things where you really gotta learn to step back and appreciate how far you've come as a woodworker, because even a year ago, if you'd asked me to make up a nice square frame like I'm doing here, I would have had to take the time to stop and think about what I'm doing, and it would have been a little bit of a slower going process, whereas here, I was basically able to just go on autopilot. I knew exactly what needed to be done, I knew all the steps that needed to be taken to go from pieces of wood to an actual tabletop. But that brings us to this large piece of what was called white oak when I bought it. Now I say that because I don't genuinely believe that it is white oak. This was from one of the lumberyards that I go to where they just kind of give you stuff, you don't get to actually pick it out for yourself. And so the problem with this piece is it's got a lot of the characteristics of white oak, so I got to pay that white oak price, but it's got the color of red oak, which has made it very challenging to try and incorporate that into a project. But that's where the whole staining thing has come in very handy, because what it means is I can take this piece that looks like it has the same grain structure as a lot of the other stuff that I'm using in this project, but then I can stain it to be a color that actually looks good. And I know there's a lot of people out there, again, some people don't like staining, some people love the natural color of red oak, I don't know why, it's a very weird color, but overall, it just was not a color that I knew would work for other projects. So this just being able to go through and stain it to be a color that I wanted was just amazing. And the best part about this is that I actually have a very good idea of what I'm going to do with the rest of that board and actually use it in a project finally. But now we get to the part of the project where the hardcore traditional woodworkers start to die a little inside as I take this natural, beautiful hardwood and apply stain to it. Now the reason I'm doing this is just purely for the creative freedom that stain adds, because if I wanted to make this same piece of furniture using natural woods, I would basically have to build the structure out of walnut and then make the panels out of ebony, because that's what we're going to be doing here. We're making the structure of this thing dark brown, and then the panels are going to be black, as pure black as I can possibly get them. So if I was to do this with natural wood, no one on this planet could probably afford that piece of furniture, or they probably wouldn't want to anyway. It wouldn't be worthwhile. But the fact here that I can take a nice inexpensive hardwood like ash, which is one of the more affordable hardwoods that are available, make it be colors that I want, and it still looks good, that to me is the single most important thing. I don't really care what people's personal opinions are when it comes to staining. In my opinion, the final piece of furniture here looks amazing. It looks the exact way that I wanted it to, and this is also going to piss a lot of people off. This is actually going to become a very common style that you're probably going to see on my channel, because I absolutely love the way that this project came out. The way that the colors blend, that natural white oak interior, the way that all of these components come together and they just work so well to have this very subtle contrast to the entire piece. This is a style or a way of making a piece of furniture that I've always dreamt about but never really understood how to make, and it's taken me years now to get to the point where I can finally create something that is exactly what I'd always imagined. Now the final step here is to go through and make our pins. Now the pins were a little bit of excessive work on my part, because I would go through and make each of these pins individually on my lathe. Just going through and shaping them, adding in a nice round over to the front, making sure that everything is sized up as perfectly as that absolutely can. Now the reason I don't just use like a dowel cutter or dowel former to pound through a bunch of dowels and then make those afterwards is just because I find that this gives me absolute control over how my dowels and my pins are going to look, because I want these to be absolutely perfect. That round over on the front is on pretty much every single pin is almost perfectly measured out, and it's polished up to a point where it's going to hold that edge. Then this is one of my favorite tricks that I've figured out, is using this block to then perfectly size up each of my pins so that I know they're going to sit at the exact same depth in all of the holes that I drilled earlier on. So this whole process is all about absolute accuracy in making these pins and giving them the exact look that I know that I want. Then for the pins that are going to be going in the door and the tabletop, I just had to throw them in my drill, hit them on some sandpaper real quick, and then we could move on to the staining process. So here's one place where I would have loved to have access to some ebony or something that would have had a little bit of a better natural color. These ones didn't work great, but it worked enough to give me that black look in all of the pins. So it worked okay, but it's definitely not a way that I would do it in the future if I have a little bit of extra money. I would definitely invest in a little bit of ebony here because it would look a little bit better. But with everything completed, it's now time for the glue up. Now, as you can see, I'm using hide glue because it makes things a little bit easier. I have to say I'm a huge fan of hide glue for structural joinery. It is a little bit of a mess because it was pouring out everywhere, it was getting over everything, but because I had a really good wax coating over all of my pieces at this point, and that wax was pretty much fully cured up, that hide glue was super easy to just wipe off with some warm water, and even the areas where the hide glue actually dried on the finish, I was able to just kind of rub it off without damaging the finish. So it's really important that if you want to do a glue up like this, make sure that you have your pieces fully finished up and you let that finish cure for at least a couple days before you're trying to put that hide glue in there. But this glue up was the perfect example of why I love traditional joinery, because even though I'm using glue, just by using those pins, all I have to do is put my pieces together, tap those pins into place, and I'm done. There's no worrying about clamps, there's no anything that has to be put together, held together nice and square. I know that when I pound those pins in, everything is being automatically squared up because I took all that time before to put things in that nice square order. You will notice here that I'm actually forgetting a couple components on the right hand side there. There should be some drawer slide mounts and they are not there. So that was a bit of an annoyance, but we'll figure that out as we go further into the project. But at this point in time, I was excited enough that this thing was starting to come together, and you can see just how all these parts start to drop into place super easily. This bottom panel is actually just sitting on some shelf pins, that way it's easily removable, so if I ever need to take out that middle drawer section, all I have to do is just remove that bottom panel, and I can drop that whole drawer section out the bottom of the cabinet. But other than that, this whole glue up, this was one of the easiest glue ups I've ever done. Now, it was challenging because obviously there's a little bit of stress about getting everything together in the allotted time, but just by, again, having those pins in place, I knew as soon as I put those pins in that everything was going to be fine. Everything was going to be good to go. I was going to pull all my parts together in the exact way that I needed them to, and it just made the whole process so much easier. So if you've never worked with traditional joinery before, I highly recommend it because it does genuinely make your life easier. So because I forgot to add in those two drawer slide mounts when I was doing the glue up, it was actually a pretty simple fix. All I did was just screw in a couple pieces, add in a little bit of filler to make sure that they were sitting flush with the legs, and then screw them in. Now, it's very unfortunate that I forgot to actually put them in during the glue up, but this also worked just fine. There's no strength loss, there's no problem with these. And then I can add in the actual drawer slides and then start to fit up the drawers. Now, this is where I was actually really excited to start seeing everything come together, because with those drawers in place, we can now add in our drawer fronts, and this is where the project just starts kind of taking on a life of its own. It's starting to look super cool. I'm kind of starting to get to see how this whole thing is coming together, and the excitement in me at this point is just growing like crazy, because I genuinely couldn't believe that I was able to create this piece that I was imagining in my head. But of course, that doesn't come without struggle. Trying to drop this mostly put together cabinet over this middle floating shelf was a little bit challenging, trying not to scratch anything and being very delicate with it, but eventually it all went together. And again, this is just so cool to me, the fact that this idea actually worked out. Having this variable height floating shelf that has drawers and everything in it, super cool. Another thing that came to light after I did all my staining was that I'd completely forgotten to drill any of my holes for my knobs and screws and whatnot. So I had to be very careful. I used a little bit of chalk to mark out my holes, and I was just as delicate as I possibly could to not get tear out. And again, everything just kind of went together fine. So this final section of the video here is just a perfect example of how I screwed up on a lot of little things. Forgetting to put in parts during a glue up, forgetting to drill holes in that before I did all my staining. That was a really dumb thing to do, legitimately. I definitely should have known better and put in those holes beforehand, but there's always ways you can go back and fix any mistakes you potentially make. And this is one of my favorite points that I've had a lot of people tell me, is that being a good woodworker is not about not making mistakes, it's about knowing and having the creative mentality in order to fix those mistakes when they happen. And the best way to learn this skill is just when you make a mistake, think about how to fix it, don't just throw a part out. Then for a very last minute change, I decided to try making a veneered back panel. So I cut all my veneers on the bandsaw, I used my drum sander to get them all nicely thickness down and sand it up to about 220 grit, and then using some hide glue, I glued them to a piece of just generic Home Depot plywood. Now this is not the best way to do this, but it is a way that works in a small shop if you don't have something like a vacuum press. And I will say that this is going to become pretty much standard practice for my back panels now, because not only was it a little bit cheaper, it also just worked out great. But anyways guys, I do hope you enjoyed this project and this video. I'm really looking forward to reading your thoughts in the comments down below. But as always guys, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one.